On a gray morning that made the harbor look like a bruise, Port Charles held its breath without knowing why. The city's usual hum, gulls trading insults, ferry horns folding over the water, the clatter of loading docks, fell into a strange, anticipatory hush, as if something in the air had warned every passerby to tread softer. By noon, that warning had a name and a timestamp. A fire on Pier 47. A single casualty on scene. An emergency call that would ripple through families and alliances like a stone hurled into thin ice. #####the call no parent, no protector, wants. The news reached Sonny first because tragedy still respects the old pathways of information in Port Charles. His phone lit, and a lifetime of reflexes rose in him, the man who plans for worst cases before breakfast, who hears the timbre of fear inside a dispatcher's neutral cadence. He did not ask many questions. Experience had taught him that questions can wait, but victims cannot. The name on the report was a young dock worker, part-time student, part-time mentor at a church program Sonny had funded quietly for years. He had been moving a crate when the crate moved him, a concussive energy that folded steel like paper and turned the river's skin to froth. There are losses that bruise communities, and there are losses that burrow into a single heart. This one did both. The boy had been a gentler mirror of the city's grit, stubborn in all the right ways, hopeful when he had no reason to be. Sonny felt the truth peel through him. His money had built the program, but his world had built the pier. He could not tell where responsibility ended and grief began. He went to the water anyway, because that is what he does. He shows up. He reads the grammar of disaster, the way firefighters avoid looking at one another when they are carrying bad news, the way detectives cradle evidence like it might scratch them, the way the smoke itself behaves when it knows it is done. Carly learned in a different register. For her, grief arrives as motion. She pushes through doors, she gathers staff, she makes calls nobody wants to make and hears the tightness at the edge of her own voice but keeps moving. When the first sketch of the incident reached her, industrial accident, one confirmed, investigation ongoing, she felt the old instinct to audit every choice of the morning, the texts unanswered because she was rushing, the message she meant to send the young man after he'd refilled coffee at the Metro Court with that shy smile. The brain always builds timelines in hindsight, looking for a lever to pull that could rewind fate. Carly knew there is no lever. She moved anyway, because movement felt like mercy. What made this news sadder than all the typical tragedies that drift across a headline was not simply the lost potential of a life ordered around second chances, it was the pattern that flickered behind the explosion. Too many things at once, a crate not on any manifest. A fire with a chemistry that suggested precision, a death that looked like collateral, which is to say, like a message. Sonny has always understood messages, both how to send them and how to refuse receipt. He stood on the edge of the pier as divers finished their sweep and promised himself something simple and unyielding: the river would not be allowed to keep the truth. #### The sorrow that multiplies. Sad news does not confine itself to one family in Port Charles, it migrates. By late afternoon, the name of the casualty was public. Photos surfaced, the boy laughing at a charity picnic, standing beside Sonny at a scholarship ceremony, pouring coffee at Carly's hotel with sleeves rolled to the elbow. Comment sections turned into vigils, rumor mills spun, the moral accountants of the city started their tallying. Sonny noticed none of it. He was busy counting the human beings attached to the weight of the day, the boy's mother, who had worked night shifts so her son could finish school, his friends, who took pride in refusing pity, the priest, who would have to say something on Sunday that did not collapse under its own earnestness. Carly reached them first, because she knows how to bridge the space between the unbearable and the practical, organizing meals, arranging expenses discreetly, turning her hotel into a sanctuary where sorrow could sit without being looked at. If the story were only this, a community mourning a young man lost to a freak industrial disaster, it would already be too much. But even as the memorial candles were bought, a separate thread tightened across town. #### The dossier that should not exist. Anna Devane has lived long enough in the crosswinds of intelligence work to recognize a pattern when it chooses to reveal itself. Her morning had begun with a call that should have been ordinary, a follow-up about a dormant WSB archive request she had filed months ago and then half forgotten. Instead of a routine still pending, the voice on the line carried a mix of apology and alarm. The archive had flagged her request as a collision with a classified recovery. The term was bureaucratically vague, but the implication was not. Someone had been inside the file she was trying to retrieve, and that someone had left fingerprints that belonged to her. Shocking news is not the same as new information. Sometimes it is the reclassification of knowledge you thought you had put to bed. The file in question was a relic, an old operation with a bright codename and a darker conclusion, sealed under layers of legal lacquer. Anna had believed the paperwork was tidy, the loose ends trimmed. The call told her otherwise. Not only had the file been opened, its contents had been cross-referenced with recent incidents along the East Coast involving carefully constructed accidents that behaved the way professional sabotage behaves: no flamboyance, no signature, just statistics bent at an angle only trained eyes notice. The courier arrived an hour later, because that is how the past works when it decides it needs your attention. It knocks in person. He did not carry the original file. Those pages were still locked behind the kind of clearance that pretends to be moral. He carried a summary, a map of overlaps, and a single image printed on matte paper. It showed a metal plate recovered from a burned crate in a port 2 states away. The plate had been stamped with a manufacturer's insignia discontinued 20 years ago. Someone had kept a dead brand alive just long enough to design catastrophe and hide it inside normal commerce. Anna's mind performed the terrible calculus that men and women in her line of work learn: if this, then that. If the old insignia appears now, then an old adversary is awake. If the metal plate travels in supply chains that end at small harbors, then those harbors are rehearsal spaces. If rehearsal spaces exist, then opening night is approaching. She did not know yet which stage would be chosen. She only knew Port Charles had already felt a tremor. #####, 2 lines, 1 intersection. By late evening, the river had given up all it would, and the pier had been cleared. Sonny returned home with the quiet of someone who refuses to dignify pain with a show. He is not a man easily startled by coincidence, but he also does not patronize himself with denial. The fire had been too neat around its edges. The missing manifest had been too perfectly absent. He rewound the day in his head and found himself circling the same question: who benefits from sorrow masquerading as misfortune? At the same hour, Anna turned the courier's summary into a game of edges and centers, pinning names and places to a board that never leaves her office. Patterns emerged that had the elegance of something designed by a careful mind with a cruel purpose. One point on her map blinked brighter than the others: a shell company that had dissolved on paper 5 years ago but still paid a storage lease on an anonymous unit in a warehouse district a mile inland from the Port Charles waterfront. The leaseholder of record was a trust whose custodian had once appeared in the footnotes of that old WSB operation, an asset who refused retirement and believed that history is simply the future with better lighting. Anna did not call anyone first. She went to the unit herself, because urgency sometimes outruns protocol. What she found was not a treasure of evidence but something worse: an emptiness too clean to be innocent and too recent to be accident. Racks of industrial shelving left faint shadows. The air still had the sharpness of oils that hadn't yet fully dissipated. In the corner, a small, almost apologetic bin of debris. A charred sliver of wood. A melted fragment of plastic. And one thing that did not belong: a silver charm, flattened by heat, in the shape of a tiny compass. She knew that charm. Years ago, an operative had carried an identical one as a joke about her own broken sense of direction. The operative had disappeared on an assignment that went sideways and never sent a final signal. The WSB had written her into the ledger of lost assets and moved on. Anna had never fully believed the ledger. ##### the truth inside the shock. The shocking news was not that the past had found a way to knock, it was that it had chosen to do so in a language only Anna would understand. The compass was a signature, but it was also a plea. It said, "I am not gone." It said, "I am compromised, but I am still me." It said, "Follow this, and you will find a second thing you do not want to find." When Anna left the warehouse, the wind had picked up and convinced the loose siding to talk. She called in a favor that sounded nothing like a favor: quiet surveillance, no paperwork, eyes on every truck that entered the district. She knew the second thing was likely already moving. She drove toward the harbor because you do not choose the place you receive bad news, it chooses you. Sonny and Carly were together when Anna arrived. Grief has a way of rearranging seating charts and alliances. The three of them have known each other long enough to recognize when rivalry must step outside so resolve can sit down. Anna delivered her shock without dramatics: facts first, then the shape of the threat, then the piece that made the air in the room contract. The plate recovered from the out-of-state fire had an exact match in Port Charles. Forensics had pulled a fragment from the Pier 47 debris with the same dead insignia. Whatever happened at noon was not a fluke. It was a footnote. Sadness thickens when it acquires context. Sonny felt his private ache harden into a public vow. Carly felt her 1,000 acts of practical care escalate into strategy. Anna felt the complicated emotion she always tries to keep at arm's length: guilt's stubborn cousin, responsibility. In her field, shocking news is never a finish line, it is a starting gun. #### the city after midnight. Port Charles at midnight is not the same town it pretends to be during the day. It is honest in the dark, its compromises less perfumed. Word of the pier tragedy had already been transmuted into whispers about safety inspections and backroom favors and whose fingerprints were where they shouldn't be. The Metro Court lobby had become a soft-lit commons for people who needed to be near other heartbeats. On the docks, the water wore a black sheen that devoured reflections. Patrol boats stitched restless seams. Anna returned to the board in her office and allowed herself a single, unsentimental conclusion: the adversary designing these accidents had studied her career, had memorized the city's habit of looking in the wrong direction when grief is loudest. Sonny and Carly returned to their separate corners of the night with matching promises. To the boy's mother, to each other, to their own bruised sense of what community means when violence wears the mask of mischance. #### what grief makes possible. The next day would bring the mechanics of consequence, statements, a public assurance of resources, a private correction of blind spots. It would also bring something that Port Charles, for all its cynicism, never completely loses: the impulse to show up. Funds would be raised without fanfare. Meals would arrive without notes. Strangers would stand a little nearer to one another in elevators and say nothing, the silence itself a kind of crowded prayer. But the city would also feel the new shape of the danger. Sonny would begin to rearrange his own perimeter, shrinking it and strengthening it, inviting scrutiny to confuse the watcher. Carly would look at her staff list as if it were a manifest and test each entry against a simple, unsparing question: who benefits if we miss a detail? And Anna would do the work only she can do: tease the motive out of the method, flatten the myth of coincidence until the map of intent appears. #### the present tense of loss. Sad news and shocking news are not the same, but they share a grammar. They interrupt. They insist. They demand redefinition, of a day, of a plan, of a person. Sonny and Carly stood inside the interruption and refused to let it tell the whole story. Anna took the shock and translated it into a task list no one else could write. Between them stretched a city that has learned to metabolize pain without becoming it. The harbor would heal at its own pace. The scorch marks would fade, the paperwork would grow a spine and march toward court, the headlines would drift to other storms. But the empty chair at a kitchen table would remain, and so would the new understanding that the past is not content to be archived. It wants to be current. It wants to be hand-delivered in the form of a compass charm left in a place only one person would think to search. In Port Charles, grief is never just an ending, it is a set of coordinates. Sonny and Carly now carry one half of the map: the cost, the communal promise, the refusal to surrender to accident as explanation. Anna carries the other: the pattern, the adversary's silhouette, the thin, bright line that runs from an old codename to a young man's final morning on the pier. Between them lies the work of turning sorrow into clarity and shock into prevention. The river kept its slow counsel as dawn prepared to unspool another day. Somewhere inland, a storage unit stood a little too empty. Somewhere offshore, a cargo route arced toward a destination it had not yet earned. And in 3 separate rooms, 3 people who have weathered more plots than most cities see in a century decided, separately and together, that the next news Port Charles receives will not arrive as an ambush. It will arrive, if they have anything to say about it, as a choice.